Kieran's claws clicked against the metal table as he reviewed the Alliance documents for the third time. The Altine warrior had fought in 17 major conflicts across the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Devourers had appeared 6 months ago, consuming entire star systems in their path. Now every species in the known galaxy faced extinction, unless they worked together. The conference room door slid open with a soft hiss. Kieran looked up expecting to see another delegation of tall, proud alien representatives. Instead, 3 relatively small bipedal creatures walked in. They moved with quiet confidence, their pale skin and small frames making them appear almost fragile compared to the other species present. "You must be the Altine military advisor," the lead human said, extending a strange appendage. "I'm Captain Reed, and these are my tactical officers." Kieran stared at the offered hand, unsure of its purpose. After an awkward moment, Captain Reed lowered it and gestured to the chairs across from Kieran. The humans sat down without ceremony, their movements precise but relaxed. "We've read your military records," Captain Reed continued, pulling out a datapad. "Impressive combat history. The Battle of Centauri Prime was particularly well executed." Kieran's chest swelled with pride. That victory had taken 3 years of careful planning and superior technology. "Your species is new to galactic warfare," he replied, trying to sound diplomatic. "Perhaps you should observe our strategies before engaging the Devourers directly." The humans exchanged glances that Kieran couldn't interpret. One of the tactical officers, a female with short dark hair, leaned forward. "We appreciate the offer, but we've already analyzed the Devourer attack patterns. Our preliminary battle plans are ready for review." She activated a holographic display that filled the air above the table. Kieran watched in growing disbelief as the human strategy unfolded before him. Ship formations that deliberately exposed themselves to enemy fire, ground forces that advanced directly into the strongest Devourer positions, evacuation routes that required military units to hold impossible defensive lines. "This is suicide," Kieran said flatly. "Your casualty projections must be completely wrong." Captain Reed's expression didn't change. "The numbers are accurate. We estimate 70% losses in the first wave alone." "Then why would you proceed with such a plan?" "Because it will work," the female officer replied simply. "The Devourers expect prey to run. They don't expect prey to attack." Kieran felt his secondary heart begin racing, a biological response to extreme stress. In Altine culture, military leaders spent decades perfecting strategies that minimized casualties while maximizing tactical advantages. The idea of deliberately choosing massive losses seemed insane. "Your species has no experience with enemies like the Devourers," Kieran explained patiently. "They consume everything in their path. Conventional tactics won't work, but neither will throwing lives away pointlessly." The third human, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured. "We've faced extinction before. Multiple times, actually. It taught us something important about survival. What could your species possibly know about extinction that the rest of us don't? That sometimes the only way to save everything is to sacrifice everything," Captain Reed answered. "We're not throwing lives away. We're investing them." Kieran's translator struggled with the concept. In his language, there was no word that combined death with investment. The closest equivalent suggested insanity or religious fanaticism. The holographic display shifted to show casualty estimates for other species if the human plan succeeded. The numbers were dramatically lower than any other proposed strategy. Somehow, by accepting massive human losses, the overall galactic casualties would be reduced by over 60%. "You're using your own people as shields," Kieran realized with horror. "We're using ourselves as weapons," the female officer corrected. "There's a difference." Captain Reed stood up and walked to the window overlooking the space station's docking bays. "We know what you're thinking. That we're primitive, reckless, maybe even defective. Every other species that's met us has reached the same conclusion." Kieran watched as human supply ships unloaded cargo in the distance. The crews worked with quiet efficiency, showing no signs of fear or desperation despite the approaching threat. "But here's what you don't understand," Captain Reed continued. "We're not brave because we don't feel fear. We're brave because we've learned to fear the right things." "And what do humans fear?" Kieran asked, genuinely curious now. "Failing to protect others? Surviving when we could have made a difference? Living with the knowledge that we chose safety over saving lives?" The room fell silent. Kieran studied the battle plans again, trying to understand the human perspective. Every tactical decision seemed designed to minimize alien casualties while maximizing human risk. It was unlike anything he had encountered in decades of military service. "Your fleet commanders have agreed to this strategy?" he finally asked. "They have," Captain Reed confirmed, "along with our planetary governors, colony administrators, and civilian populations. Humanity is committed to this approach." Kieran felt a chill run through his scales. An entire species had voted for what amounted to mass suicide in the name of protecting strangers. It defied every principle of survival and self-preservation that guided civilized behavior. "We'll need detailed coordination protocols," he found himself saying. "If Altine forces are going to support your operations, we need to understand exactly how your units plan to engage." Captain Reed smiled for the first time since entering the room. "I was hoping you'd say that. We've prepared comprehensive briefing materials for all Allied forces." As the humans began explaining their coordination requirements, Kieran realized something troubling. Despite their seemingly insane strategy, their tactical knowledge was flawless. They understood enemy capabilities, logistical requirements, and operational timing better than species with centuries more military experience. These weren't desperate primitives making reckless gambles. They were highly skilled warriors who had simply calculated that the best way to win was to die. The meeting continued for several hours, covering everything from communication protocols to resource allocation. With each detail, Kieran became more disturbed by human military thinking. They had contingency plans for scenarios that assumed total unit destruction. They discussed casualty replacement rates with the same calm precision other species used for equipment maintenance. When the session finally ended, Kieran remained in the conference room long after the humans had left. He stared at the tactical displays still floating in the air, trying to process what he had witnessed. Tomorrow, joint training exercises would begin. He would watch human forces in action and see if their behavior matched their disturbing strategic philosophy. Part of him hoped it was all elaborate psychological warfare designed to intimidate their enemies. But deep down, Kieran suspected he was about to discover something about humans that would change his understanding of courage forever. The joint military base buzzed with activity as Kieran walked through the human quarters. 3 days had passed since the strategy meeting, and he still couldn't shake his unease about their battle plans. He had come to observe their pre-combat preparations, expecting to find signs of the desperation that must drive such reckless tactics. Instead, he found soldiers playing cards. "Royal flush," announced Private Cole, laying down his hand with a grin. "That's dinner for a week, Nash." The other soldiers groaned and tossed their cards on the makeshift table. Kieran approached cautiously, his translator working to interpret the strange human ritual. "Gambling before battle?" he asked. Cole looked up with bright eyes. "Just having some fun while we can. Want to join the next hand?" Kieran's confusion deepened. These humans faced almost certain death in less than 48 hours, yet they seemed remarkably cheerful. "Are you not concerned about the upcoming engagement?" "Worried sick," Nash replied casually, shuffling the cards. "But worrying won't change anything, so might as well enjoy ourselves." The casual admission stunned Kieran. In Altine culture, warriors entering dangerous situations spent their final hours in meditation and ritual preparation. They certainly didn't waste time on frivolous games. "Tell me about your families," Kieran said, settling beside the group. Perhaps understanding their personal connections would explain their strange behavior. Cole immediately pulled out a small device showing moving images. "These are my kids. Amy just turned 8 and little Ben is 5. Smart as anything, both of them." The images showed 2 small humans playing in what appeared to be a garden. They laughed and ran with the innocent joy that all young creatures displayed. Kieran watched Cole's face as he talked about his offspring, noting the mixture of love and sadness in his expression. "You know you might not see them again?" Kieran observed. "Yeah," Cole said simply. "That's exactly why I have to fight." The logic baffled Kieran completely. Wouldn't they rather have their father alive than dead in a glorious battle? Nash leaned forward, his expression serious for the first time. "Let me ask you something. If the Devourers reach human space, what happens to Cole's kids?" Kieran considered the question. The Devourers consumed all biological matter they encountered, leaving only empty worlds behind. They would be killed. Not just killed, Cole corrected quietly. Consumed, absorbed, turned into fuel for more Devourers. And after that, they'd move on to the next world and the next until every child in the galaxy shared the same fate. So we fight here, Nash continued. We stop them as far from home as possible. And if that means Cole's kids grow up without their father, at least they get to grow up. The simple mathematics of sacrifice hit Kieran like a physical blow. Humans weren't choosing between safety and glory. They were choosing between personal survival and species survival, and they consistently chose the species. But surely there must be another way, Kieran protested. Advanced tactics, better technology, some strategy that doesn't require such losses. Private Torres, who had been quietly cleaning her weapon during the conversation, finally spoke up. You think we enjoy this? You think we want to die? Her tone carried an edge that made Kieran's defensive instincts flare. I'm simply trying to understand your reasoning. Our reasoning is simple, Torres continued. We've run the simulations 1,000 times. We've analyzed every possible approach. This is the only way that saves the most lives overall. She gestured to a wall display showing casualty projections for different battle strategies. Human-led frontal assaults showed massive human losses but dramatically reduced casualties for other species. We're not suicidal, Cole added. We're just willing to do what needs to be done. Kieran spent the next several hours observing human behavior throughout the base. In the mess hall, soldiers shared stories and laughed at jokes he didn't understand. In the recreation areas, they played competitive games with intense focus. In the communication centers, they recorded messages for families back home. The messages disturbed him most of all. He listened to dozens of humans calmly explaining to their loved ones that they might not return, but that the sacrifice was necessary. Parents told children to be brave. Spouses promised their love would endure beyond death. Friends made plans for reunions they knew might never happen. It's called closure, Captain Reed explained when Kieran asked about the recordings. We don't want to leave things unsaid, but surely this affects morale. Constantly discussing death and separation? Reed considered the question carefully. It would be worse to pretend death isn't possible. We acknowledge it, accept it, and then focus on what we can control. They walked past a group of soldiers engaged in what appeared to be a solemn ceremony. Each warrior placed a small object in a collection box while speaking briefly to their companions. Personal effects, Reed explained. Things they want returned to families if they don't make it back. Dog tags, wedding rings, letters, photos. Some write instructions for how they want to be remembered. Kieran watched a young soldier place a child's drawing in the box. The crayon artwork showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The soldier's hands trembled slightly as he let go of the drawing. This is torture, Kieran whispered. Why do you force them to confront mortality so directly? Because denial leads to panic, Reed replied. Accept the possibility of death and you can function despite it. Pretend it won't happen, and you freeze when it does. That evening, Kieran joined a group of human soldiers for their evening meal. The food was simple but nourishing, and the conversation ranged from technical discussions about equipment to stories about life before the war. What about you? Nash asked Kieran. What's your homeworld like? Kieran described the crystal spires of Altine cities and the floating gardens that provided food for billions. He talked about the complex honor codes that governed warrior behavior and the lengthy rituals that preceded any military campaign. Sounds beautiful, Cole said wistfully. Maybe when this is over, some of us can visit. The casual assumption that humans would survive the coming battle surprised Kieran. I thought you expected to die in the engagement. We expect heavy casualties, Torres corrected. That's not the same thing as expecting total annihilation. Some of us will make it through. How do you choose who lives and who dies? The humans exchanged glances that carried meaning Kieran couldn't interpret. We don't choose, Reed said finally. Everyone goes in with the same mission. Stop the devourers and protect the evacuation routes. Who comes back depends on luck, skill, and circumstances beyond our control. But surely unit commanders make decisions about deployment and risk allocation. Of course, but those decisions are based on tactical requirements, not personal value judgments. Every human life has equal worth. The concept struck Kieran as both noble and terrifying. Altan military doctrine included clear hierarchies of value based on rank, experience, and genetic lineage. The idea that foot soldiers and commanders shared equal worth in life and death decisions seemed chaotic. As the evening progressed, Kieran began to notice subtle patterns in human behavior. Soldiers checked on each other's equipment without being asked. They shared resources freely, even with members of other units. They offered encouragement and support to anyone showing signs of stress or uncertainty. "You take care of each other," he observed. "That's the point," Nash replied. "We're all in this together. Species, unit, individual, it doesn't matter. We protect each other because that's what makes us human." Kieran left the human quarters that night with more questions than answers. These warriors displayed none of the fatalistic resignation he expected from soldiers facing certain death. Instead, they showed a strange combination of acceptance and determination that defied his understanding of military psychology. Tomorrow would bring the first joint training exercises. He would finally see if human actions matched their puzzling words. Alarms screamed across the command deck as the first Devourer ships emerged from hyperspace. Kieran watched the tactical display with growing dread as hundreds of dark vessels materialized in the void, their twisted shapes pulsing with unnatural energy. "Contact confirmed," the communications officer reported. "Devourer fleet detected at coordinates 77 Alpha. Estimated vessel count 436. Kieran felt his stomach drop. Intelligence reports had predicted half that number. The Alliance fleet suddenly seemed pitifully small against the approaching swarm. "All human vessels advance to engagement range." Captain Reed's voice crackled over the communication system. "Execute Battle Plan Alpha on my mark." "Wait," Kieran called out, rushing to the communication station. "The enemy numbers are far higher than anticipated. We should retreat and regroup." Reed's image appeared on the main screen, his expression calm despite the circumstances. "Negative. The refugee convoy is 12 hours behind us. If we retreat now, the Devourers will intercept them before they reach safe harbor. But your casualties will be enormous. This force is twice what we planned for. Then we'll have to be twice as effective," Reed replied simply. "All units commence attack run." Kieran watched in horrified fascination as the human fleet broke formation and accelerated directly toward the Devourer swarm. No defensive positioning, no attempt to exploit tactical advantages, just a straight charge into overwhelming enemy numbers. "They're insane," the Altine fleet commander muttered beside him. The first weapons exchange lit up space with violent energy. Devourer ships fired streams of corrosive plasma that ate through hull plating like acid. Human vessels returned fire with everything they had, their weapon systems blazing continuously, even as their shields failed under enemy bombardment. "Human vessel designation Defiance reports critical hull breach," the tactical officer announced. "They're requesting immediate evacuation support." "Negative on evacuation," came the response from the Defiance. "We're making attack runs on the command cluster. Send support to the convoy ships instead." Kieran stared at the display as the Defiance, its hull split open and venting atmosphere, continued firing at Devourer targets. The ship was clearly dying, but its crew kept fighting until the final reactor explosion took out 3 enemy vessels. "This is madness," Kieran whispered, but the madness was working. Despite taking massive casualties, the human ships were disrupting Devourer formations and drawing enemy fire away from the more vulnerable Alliance vessels. Their seemingly reckless attacks were creating openings that the other fleets could exploit. Human Destroyer Courage is on collision course with Devourer. Battleship, the tactical officer reported with disbelief in his voice. Kieran watched as the small human vessel accelerated toward a massive enemy ship 10 times its size. The Devourer vessel turned to avoid the collision, exposing its vulnerable underside to Allied fire. The Courage struck the enemy ship with enough force to crack its hull, and both vessels vanished in a brilliant explosion. "They're using their own ships as weapons," the fleet commander said in horror. "No," Kieran corrected, beginning to understand. "They're using them as tools. Each sacrifice creates an opportunity for the rest of us." The battle raged for 3 hours. Kieran counted 17 human vessels destroyed, each one taking multiple Devourer ships with them. The enemy formation began to break apart under the relentless human assault, their predictable tactics useless against opponents who treated death as an acceptable cost of victory. "Devourer fleet is retreating," the communications officer announced with surprise. "Remaining vessels are jumping to hyperspace." The aftermath was sobering. The Alliance had won, but at terrible cost. Of the 43 human ships that entered the battle, only 11 remained operational. The other species had lost a combined total of 6 vessels. "Casualty reports are coming in," the tactical officer said quietly. Human losses, 3,247 personnel. Allied losses, 412 personnel. Kieran felt sick. The humans had absorbed over 80% of total casualties while making up less than half the fleet. They had literally thrown themselves between the Devourers and everyone else. Why? He asked when Captain Reed's image appeared on screen again. Why sacrifice so many of your own people for us? Reed looked tired but resolved. Because someone had to, and we were the only ones willing to pay the price. The refugee convoy arrived 6 hours later, carrying over 2 million civilians from 12 different species. Kieran watched the massive passenger ships dock at the space station, their holds packed with families fleeing the Devourer advance. Among the refugees were thousands of Altine civilians, including Kieran's own sister and her children. They had escaped certain death because human warriors chose to die instead of retreat. The children want to thank the human soldiers, Kieran's sister told him during their reunion. They heard about the battle on the ship's communication systems. Kieran looked across the station's main concourse where small groups of alien children approached human survivors. The warriors, many bearing fresh wounds and exhaustion, knelt down to accept drawings, flower petals, and other small gifts from the young refugees. Private Cole sat in a medical chair while a doctor treated burns across his arm. 3 alien children clustered around him, chattering in languages his translator couldn't process. He smiled and nodded anyway, accepting their colorful artwork with genuine pleasure. Doesn't it hurt? One young Altine asked through her translator. Being so brave? Cole considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But you know what hurts more? Knowing someone needs help and not providing it. The child nodded solemnly and handed him another drawing. This one showed human and alien figures standing together under a field of stars. For your family, she explained, so they know you saved us. Kieran watched Cole's expression change as he looked at the artwork. For just a moment, the human soldier's careful composure cracked, revealing the depth of emotion he usually kept hidden. Thank you, Cole whispered. This means everything to me. Later that evening, Kieran found himself in the human section of the medical bay. Wounded warriors filled every bed, but their spirits seemed remarkably high. They shared stories about the battle, checked on each other's injuries, and made plans for the next engagement. You don't seem defeated, Kieran observed to Nash, whose leg was immobilized by medical equipment. Why would we be defeated? We won. But you lost so many people. Nash's expression grew serious. Every person we lost saved dozens of others. Their deaths had meaning and purpose. That's not defeat, that's victory. The concept challenged everything Kieran thought he knew about military psychology. In Altine culture, heavy casualties were signs of poor leadership and failed strategy. But humans treated their losses as investments that had paid dividends and saved lives. Do you feel guilt about surviving when others didn't? Of course, Nash replied honestly. But guilt doesn't honor the dead. Living well and fighting effectively honors them. A young medic approached with Nash's medication, and Kieran noticed something remarkable. Despite being wounded himself, the medic moved with care and compassion, taking time to ensure each patient was comfortable before moving to the next. The medical staff fought in the battle too, Kieran asked. Everyone fights, the medic replied. Doctors, engineers, cooks, communications specialists. When humanity is threatened, we all become soldiers. The implication struck Kieran like a physical blow. This wasn't just a military force. It was an entire species organized around the principle of mutual protection. Every human was willing to die for every other human, and by extension for any ally who earned their trust. How do you maintain morale when death is so common? Kieran asked. Death isn't common, Nash corrected. Death with purpose is common. There's a difference. As Kieran prepared to leave the medical bay, he overheard a conversation between 2 wounded humans planning their return to duty. They discussed modifications to their battle tactics based on lessons learned from the engagement, ways to make their sacrifices even more effective in the next confrontation. They weren't planning to survive the war. They were planning to make their deaths count for as much as possible. The realization filled Kieran with a terror he had never experienced in decades of military service. He wasn't afraid of the Devourers anymore. He was afraid of the humans who fought beside him, and what their willingness to die revealed about the true nature of courage. Explosions shook the ground beneath Kieran's feet as Devourer landing pods crashed through the planet's defense grid. Haven's Edge had seemed like a perfect evacuation point just hours ago. Now it was rapidly becoming a death trap for millions of refugees still, waiting for transport off-world. Defense. Perimeter is collapsing on the Eastern Front, reported Lieutenant Torres through static-filled communications. Devourer ground forces are advancing faster than projected. Kieran crouched behind the rubble of what had been a civilian hospital, his rifle trained on the approaching enemy. Through his scope, he could see the twisted forms of Devourer shock troops moving through the ruins of the city. They consumed everything organic in their path, leaving only empty shells of buildings behind. Fall back to Checkpoint 7, he ordered his mixed unit of Altine and human soldiers. We need to regroup with the main force. Negative, came Private Nash's voice from somewhere to his left. Evacuation Zone 3 is still loading civilians. If we retreat now, those transports become sitting targets. Kieran looked toward the distant landing pads where massive ships waited to carry refugees to safety. Even from this distance, he could see crowds of people still boarding the vessels. Men, women, children, elderly individuals moving as quickly as their bodies allowed. Those transports need 15 more minutes minimum, Nash continued. We hold here. Against those numbers? We'll be overrun in 5 minutes. Then we hold for 5 minutes and make them count. The advancing Devourer force numbered in the thousands. Kieran's unit had maybe 30 soldiers, and half of them were already wounded from previous engagements. Basic mathematics said they couldn't possibly succeed, but mathematics didn't account for human determination. Cole, take your squad and hit their left flank, Nash ordered with calm authority. Torres set up crossfire patterns from the building ruins. Make every shot count. Kieran watched in amazement as the humans moved to execute the plan without question or hesitation. They knew the odds as well as he did, but they proceeded anyway with professional efficiency. The first wave of Devourers reached their position like a living nightmare. The creatures moved with predatory grace, their claws capable of tearing through armor plating. Their hunger was visible, a desperate need to consume and grow that drove them forward regardless of casualties. Human weapons fire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. The soldiers had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that caught the enemy force in a deadly crossfire. Devourer creatures fell by the dozens, but more kept coming. They're flanking around the north building, Torres reported. I count at least 50 heading for the civilian routes. I've got them, Cole responded immediately. Kieran turned to see Cole leading his 4-person squad in a direct charge toward the flanking force. They moved with disciplined speed, their weapons blazing continuously as they intercepted the Devourers before they could reach the evacuation routes. Cole's squad is cut off, Kieran realized with horror. They're surrounded. Maintain position, Nash ordered. Cover their retreat, but Cole's squad wasn't retreating. They had formed a defensive circle in the middle of the Devourer force, pouring fire in all directions. Every shot brought down an enemy, but the humans were vastly outnumbered. Fall back, Kieran shouted into his communicator. That position is untenable. Negative, Cole replied calmly. We're exactly where we need to be. Kieran understood with sick realization what the humans were doing. Cole's squad had deliberately placed themselves between the main Devourer force and the evacuation routes. They were serving as human shields, buying time with their lives. Medical transport Charlie is loaded and departing, came an announcement over the communication system. Estimated 3,000 civilians evacuated successfully. 3,000 lives saved because 4 humans chose to die. Cole's squad held their position for another 2 minutes before the overwhelming numbers finally broke through their defense. Kieran watched their signals disappear from his tactical display one by one, each death marked by a soft chime from his equipment. Transport Delta is loaded and departing, the announcer continued. Estimated 4,000 civilians evacuated successfully. They're going to overrun us, one of Kieran's Altine soldiers said, his voice tight with fear. Nash appeared beside them, somehow having crossed 50 meters of open ground without being detected. His armor was cracked and bloody, but his eyes remained focused and determined. Torres is setting charges in the main building, he reported. When those Devourers cluster for their final assault, she's going to bring the whole structure down on them. That will kill her too, Kieran protested. That's the point. The explosion will take out most of their remaining force and give the last transports time to escape. Kieran stared at Nash in disbelief. She volunteered for this? She insisted on it. Said her family lived through the attack on New Geneva because someone else made the same choice. Now it's her turn. The ground shook as hundreds of devourer creatures advanced on their position. Through the smoke and debris, Kieran could see their glowing eyes and hungry expressions. They moved with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. All transports except Echo have departed successfully, the announcer reported. Final transport loading now. Estimated completion in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Torres needed to hold the building for 4 more minutes while the last refugees escaped. Tell me about her family, Kieran found himself saying. Nash smiled grimly. 2 kids and a husband back on Earth. She shows pictures sometimes. Cute kids always getting into trouble. Normal family stuff. As if having a family was completely ordinary rather than an incredible miracle worth dying to protect. The Devourers reached the base of Torres's building and began scaling the walls with terrifying speed. Kieran could imagine her inside, alone with her explosive charges, watching the enemy climb toward her position. Transport Echo is loaded and departing, came the final announcement. All civilian evacuations complete. The building exploded. The blast was enormous, far larger than Kieran had expected. Torres must have used every piece of explosive equipment available, turning the entire structure into a massive bomb. The explosion caught the Devourer force at the moment of their triumph, vaporizing hundreds of creatures in a single devastating blast. The shockwave knocked Kieran flat and left his ears ringing. When he struggled back to his feet, the battlefield had changed completely. Where the Devourer army had been advancing, only scattered survivors remained, dazed and confused by the massive explosion. Clean-up time, Nash said, checking his weapon with professional calm. Let's finish what Torres started. The remaining battle lasted only minutes. The surviving Devourers, disorganized and decimated, fell easily to concentrated fire from the defending forces. When the shooting finally stopped, Kieran found himself standing in a crater where Torres's building had been. She saved them all, he said quietly. That was the plan, Nash replied. Torres always said she wanted her death to matter. I'd say mission accomplished. Later, as medical teams collected the wounded and prepared casualty reports, Kieran walked through the evacuation zones. The landing pad sat empty now, all the transports safely away with their precious cargo of civilian refugees. Over 20,000 people had escaped Haven's Edge because humans chose to die instead of retreat. Children who would grow up to have families of their own. Parents who would see their children reach adulthood. Elderly individuals who would live to share their wisdom with future generations. All of it purchased with human blood. The casualty reports are in, an aide informed him. Human losses 97 personnel. Allied losses 12 personnel. Nearly 100 humans dead to save 12 Allied soldiers and 20,000 civilians. The mathematics of sacrifice that governed human military thinking was becoming horrifyingly clear. Do you regret it? Kieran asked Nash as they prepared to depart the planet. Regret what? Losing so many people for the sake of strangers? Nash considered the question while looking up at the sky where the evacuation transports had disappeared into hyperspace. Ask me that question again when those refugees have children and grandchildren. When some kid grows up to discover a cure for disease or write beautiful music, or just live a good life because Torres gave him the chance to exist. But you'll never know what those lives accomplish. Don't need to know. That's what faith means. Faith. Another human concept that didn't translate well into all teen thinking. The belief that sacrifice without visible reward could still have meaning and value. As their transport lifted off from Haven's Edge, Kieran looked down at the scarred planet's surface. The cities lay in ruins, but somewhere in the galaxy, 20,000 people continued breathing because humans had been willing to stop breathing. The truly terrifying thing wasn't that humans died so easily. It was that they died so willingly. Emergency lighting cast long shadows through the underground bunker as Kieran studied the tactical displays. 3 levels above them, the battle for Haven's Edge continued with brutal intensity. Down here in the reinforced command center, the war felt distant until the occasional tremor reminded everyone that death waited just beyond the steel and concrete. Devouring forces have broken through. Sectors 4 and 7, reported the intelligence officer, her voice steady despite the grim news. They're adapting to our defensive patterns faster than anticipated. Captain Reed stood before the main display, his uniform dirty and torn from the earlier fighting. Around him, staff officers from a dozen different species worked frantically to coordinate the defense of the remaining evacuation zones. "How long until the final transports can depart?" Reed asked. 12 hours minimum," replied the logistics coordinator. "We're dealing with mechanical failures on 3 ships and overcrowding issues on the others. 12 hours. Kieran looked at the tactical situation and felt his heart sink. The human forces were already stretched beyond their limits, and the Devourers showed no signs of slowing their assault. Simple mathematics suggested that the defense would collapse long before the evacuation completed. "Sir," came a voice from the communication station, "we're receiving reports from the outer perimeter. The enemy is massing for a major assault on the primary evacuation zone." Reed moved to examine the sensor data, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "They're concentrating everything on a single target. If they break through there, the transports will be sitting ducks." Kieran joined Reed at the display, studying the enemy formation. Thousands of Devourer creatures were converging on the main landing field, where the largest refugee ships waited. The defensive force in that sector numbered less than 200 soldiers. "We need to reinforce that position immediately," Kieran suggested. "Pull units from the secondary zones." "No," Reed said quietly. "If we weaken the other positions, the Devourers will just shift their attack elsewhere. We'd be trading one disaster for another. Then what do you propose?" Reed turned to address the entire command center, his voice carrying clearly despite the ongoing noise of battle above. "I need volunteers for a special mission. Direct assault on the Devourer command structure. High casualties expected." The room fell silent. Every officer present understood what Reed was really asking. He wanted people to volunteer for suicide duty, to throw their lives away in a desperate gamble that might buy time for the evacuation. "I'll go," said Commander Harris from the Human Navy. "My ship is already badly damaged. Might as well use it for something useful." "Count me in," added Colonel Foster from the Human Marines. "My unit took heavy losses in the first wave. We're not much good for conventional operations anymore." One by one, human officers stepped forward. Not just the wounded or desperate ones, but healthy commanders with intact units and years of experience. They volunteered for certain death with the same calm professionalism they might use to, volunteer for guard duty. "This is insane," whispered the Altine intelligence officer beside Kieran. "They're destroying their own command structure." But Kieran was beginning to understand something far more disturbing. The humans weren't destroying anything. They were investing their most valuable assets in the one strategy that might actually work. "The plan is simple," Reed explained to the volunteers. "We take every available ship and ram the Devourer command vessels. Cause enough chaos in their leadership to disrupt the assault on the evacuation zone." "Ramming attacks?" Kieran couldn't hide his shock. "That's not a military tactic, that's mass suicide." "It's both," Reed replied matter-of-factly. "Sometimes the most effective military tactic is mass suicide." The volunteers began filing out to prepare their ships for the attack. Kieran watched them go, noting their expressions. No fear, no hesitation, no dramatic speeches about honor and glory. They moved with the quiet determination of people who had simply calculated the cost of victory and accepted it. "Why?" Kieran asked Reed when they were alone. "Why do this? Why sacrifice your best people for strangers?" Reed studied the tactical display for a long moment before answering. "Because we've learned something that other species haven't figured out yet." "What's that?" "The difference between surviving and living." The concept made no sense to Kieran. Survival is life. Without survival, there is nothing. "Wrong," Reed said firmly. "Survival without purpose is just existence. We don't want to exist, we want to live. And you can't truly live unless you're willing to die for something bigger than yourself." Above them, the bunker shook as the first wave of human ships launched their kamikaze attack. Kieran watched the tactical display as 16 vessels accelerated toward the Devourer command formation, their crews committed to a path that offered no possibility of return. "Human vessel Intrepid reports successful impact on enemy flagship," the communications officer announced. "Enemy command structure showing disruption patterns." One by one, the volunteer ships struck their targets. Each impact was marked by a brief flash on the tactical display, followed by the disappearance of the ship's signal. 16 crews, over 2,000 people, gone in the space of 5 minutes. But their sacrifice was working. The Devourer assault on the evacuation zone faltered as their command structure collapsed into chaos. Without central coordination, their overwhelming numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. Enemy forces are withdrawing from the primary landing field, reported the tactical officer with amazement in her voice. The evacuation can proceed on schedule. Kieran felt sick to his stomach. 2,000 humans had just died, and everyone in the bunker was celebrating because it worked. The casual acceptance of mass death as a successful outcome challenged everything he thought he knew about military ethics. "You feel guilty about it," Reed observed, noting Kieran's expression. "Don't you? Every day. But guilt doesn't change necessity." The evacuation proceeded through the night without further major incidents. Ship after ship lifted off from the surface, carrying refugees to safety among the stars. Kieran found himself counting the passengers as the reports came in. 50,000 people, 100,000, 200,000, all of them alive because humans kept choosing to die. "Final transport departing surface," came the announcement as dawn broke over the ravaged planet. Total evacuees, 437,812 individuals. Nearly 500,000 people saved. The number should have felt like a victory, but Kieran couldn't shake his growing sense of horror at the cost. "Human casualties for the entire operation," the intelligence officer reported quietly. 7,423 personnel. 7,000 humans dead to save 400,000 civilians. The mathematics was undeniable, but the implications were terrifying. "You planned this," Kieran realized suddenly. "From the very beginning, you knew you were going to sacrifice this many people." Reed nodded calmly. The projections were clear. This was the only way to save the maximum number of lives. But your own people, our people too. Their deaths hurt just as much as anyone else's. But they volunteered anyway because they understood what was at stake. Kieran thought about Private Cole and his pictures of his children. About Torres and her family back on Earth. About Nash and his quiet determination to protect people he'd never met. All of them gone now, turned into statistics in a casualty report. "How do you live with it?" he asked. "By making sure their sacrifice means something," Reed replied. "By protecting the people they died to save. By teaching other species that sometimes the greatest victory requires the greatest loss." As the last transport ships disappeared into hyperspace, Kieran found himself alone with a revelation that chilled him to his core. Humans weren't just brave soldiers or effective fighters. They were something far more dangerous. They were a species that had learned to weaponize love itself, turning their protective instincts into a force that could overcome any enemy, willing to retreat in the face of sufficient casualties. They fought not because they enjoyed violence, but because they couldn't bear to let others suffer, and that made them the most terrifying warriors in the galaxy. Because how do you fight an enemy that values your life more than their own? Smoke drifted across the scarred landscape of Haven's Edge as Kieran walked among the memorial markers. Each simple metal post represented a human life lost in the battle, their names etched in letters that would endure long after the planet healed from its wounds. 7,423 markers stretched across the field in perfect rows. The contrast was staggering. Behind him, temporary shelters housed over 400,000 refugees from dozens of different species. Families reunited, children playing in the temporary schools, elderly individuals sharing stories around communal fires, life continuing because humans had chosen to stop living. The final casualty reports came in this morning, Captain Reed said, approaching with his arm in a medical sling. He was one of only 300 human survivors from the original force of 8,000. Total Devourer losses estimated 96% of their invasion fleet. Kieran turned away from the memorial markers to study Reed's face. The human commander looked older somehow, worn down by the weight of so many losses, but his eyes remained clear and determined. "Was it worth it?" Kieran asked. "Ask them," Reed replied, gesturing toward the refugee camps. In the distance, a group of young Altine children ran between the shelters, their laughter carrying across the wind. Among them, Kieran recognized his own nephew, the son of his sister who had escaped during the first evacuation wave. The boy was alive because humans like Private Cole had chosen to die. "I've been asked to write the official battle report," Kieran said quietly. "Command wants my assessment of human military effectiveness. And what will you tell them?" Kieran considered the question carefully. How could he explain what he had witnessed? How could he make other species understand the terrifying nature of human warfare? I'll tell them the truth. That humanity doesn't fight to win wars. You fight to save lives. And that makes you more dangerous than any enemy we've ever faced. Reed nodded slowly. Will they believe you? Eventually, when they see the results for themselves. Around them, the work of rebuilding continued. Human engineers worked alongside alien architects to design new cities that could house the refugee populations. Medical teams from multiple species treated the wounded without regard for their origins. Supply officers coordinated the distribution of food and shelter to anyone who needed it. Your people aren't leaving, Kieran observed. Even after such losses, you're staying to help rebuild. Where else would we go? These people need protection, and protection is what we do. The simple statement carried implications that made Kieran shiver. Humans didn't view their sacrificial behavior as extraordinary or heroic. To them, protecting others was just their natural function in the galaxy, as automatic as breathing. I received a message from my government this morning, Kieran continued. They want to offer humanity full membership in the Altine Confederation. Equal status, shared technology, mutual defense agreements. We appreciate the offer, Reed replied carefully, but we're not looking for rewards or recognition. It's not a reward. It's recognition of necessity. After what I've witnessed, I believe humanity should be leading galactic defense initiatives, not just participating in them. The idea clearly made Reed uncomfortable. We're not conquerors or rulers. We're just people trying to do the right thing. That's exactly why you should be in charge. A group of refugee children approached them, carrying drawings and small gifts made from materials found around the camps. They presented their offerings to Reed with the solemn ceremony that children brought to important moments. For the brave humans, explained a young girl in heavily accented standard. So you know we remember. Reed knelt down to accept the gifts, his expression softening as he examined each childish artwork. The drawings showed humans and aliens standing together, fighting monsters, protecting families. Simple images that captured complex truths about sacrifice and protection. Thank you, Reed said to each child individually. These mean more to us than you could possibly know. After the children left, Reed and Kieran sat in silence among the memorial markers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field, and in the distance the sounds of reconstruction continued. I need to ask you something, Kieran said finally, and I need an honest answer. Of course. If the situation arose again, if another enemy threatened the galaxy, would humans make the same choices? Would you sacrifice your people to save the rest of us? Reed was quiet for a long time before responding. We would do whatever was necessary to protect innocent life, human or otherwise, even if it meant the extinction of your own species. Especially then, a universe where humans survive by letting others die isn't a universe worth preserving. The answer filled Kieran with a profound sense of both gratitude and terror. Humanity had essentially declared itself willing to serve as the galaxy's shield, absorbing any cost necessary to protect other species from harm. Your people scare me, Kieran admitted. Not because you're violent or aggressive, but because you're willing to pay prices that no other species would even consider. Good, Reed said with grim satisfaction. Fear is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the beginning of cooperation. As evening approached, Kieran made his way to the communications center to transmit his report to Altine Command. The message was longer and more detailed than typical military assessments, but the situation demanded thorough explanation. To Altine High Command, he dictated to the recording system. Subject: Assessment of human military capabilities and strategic recommendations. He paused, considering how to explain the impossible thing he had witnessed. After extensive observation of human combat operations, I must report that previous assessments of this species were fundamentally incorrect. Humans do not fight according to conventional military doctrine because they operate under entirely different strategic principles. The words felt inadequate, but he continued. Human military effectiveness derives not from superior technology or tactics, but from their willingness to accept casualties that other species would consider unthinkable. They treat their own lives as expendable resources to be invested in the protection of others, including allies they have never met. This behavior initially appears to be tactical insanity, but analysis of results demonstrates otherwise. Human sacrifice-based strategies consistently achieve objectives while minimizing total casualties across all species involved. He thought about Cole and Torres and Nash and all the others who had died with such casual bravery. Recommendation: humanity should be offered immediate full membership in all galactic defense organizations with senior leadership positions, not as a reward for their service, but as recognition that they alone among galactic species have demonstrated the moral courage necessary to make decisions that preserve civilization. Secondary recommendation: all species should begin studying human protective instincts and sacrifice-based tactical doctrine. In future conflicts, our survival may depend on our ability to understand and support human military operations. Final observation: humans do not fear death. They fear failure to protect others. This makes them simultaneously the most valuable allies and the most dangerous enemies any species could encounter. Personal note: I entered this assignment believing I understood courage and military honor. I was wrong. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to value others' lives above your own. By this measure, humanity represents the most courageous species in known space. Kieran ended the recording and prepared it for transmission. Tomorrow, he would return to Altine space and try to explain to his superiors what he had learned about the nature of true strength. But tonight, he walked once more among the memorial markers, reading the names of humans who had died to save people they had never met. Each marker represented a choice to value strangers above self, to treat the protection of others as more important than personal survival. In the distance, the lights of the refugee camps glowed warmly against the darkness. Families sleeping safely because humans had been willing to never sleep again. For the first time in his military career, Kieran understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Not afraid of enemies or weapons or death, but afraid of the responsibility that came with being protected by people willing to die for you. Humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson about courage that would echo across the stars for generations. The price of that lesson had been paid in human blood, and somehow they considered it a bargain.